Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today on this emotional but very important topic for Covenant House. My name is Jane Biggleson. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy at Covenant House, New York. I've been at Covenant House for 11 years, and it went like that. Prior to the advocacy work, I directed our anti-human trafficking program on the ground. Today, we're going to talk about a piece of legislation that is very important to us in protecting our young people, and that's the partial decriminalization of prostitution, which is an effort that we're working on here in New York State, but it's going on across the country. So first, though, I want to introduce two of my community partners who I'm just privileged and honored to get to work with on this legislative issue. So the first is Melanie Thompson, who is the Youth Outreach Coordinator at the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. She is a leader in the global fight to end sex trafficking. She was trafficked and sold into prostitution in New York at the age of 12, and she was later arrested and placed in foster care. And she became a fierce advocate starting at the age of 14. And she's had testified, and I've heard her testify in front of many legislatures and many other places. She is a student at Hunter College, and she plans to open a nonprofit organization to assist victims of trafficking and foster care youth. And I cannot wait to see her do that and also to see what else her future has in store. Next, we have another colleague. Ann Matheson is the program director of the Empower Center at Sanctuary for Families. Her career is focused on addressing the intersecting section of commercial sexual exploitation and violence against women and girls. She's a co-founder of the World Without Exploitation, which is a national advocacy organization that's mission is to make sure that no person is ever bought or sold, and that Covenant House is also a part of. And in 2012, she was a Fulbright Fellow, and she researched global prostitution policy in Sweden, which is why she is our research and global guru on this topic. So before I bring Mel and Ann in for more of a conversation, before we get to why this particular legislation is so important, just wanted to define a little bit about what trafficking is, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I'm going to use the New York State definition of trafficking. We really would prefer there to be a broader definition, but that is the definition that we use in New York and also under federal law as well. So I'm going to start with sex trafficking, which is most of what we see in New York State and what this webinar is focusing on. So what is sex trafficking? It is very different from what you see in movies and TV. It doesn't need to be kidnapping. It doesn't need to be crossing of straight lines. What it does involve is a commercial sex act, which is a sex act for something of value. Usually you think money, but for our young people at Covenant House, it's sadly often like food or a place to stay. And what turns prostitution into trafficking? When there's some degree of force, fraud, or coercion. Now, keep in mind that someone may, quote, consensually be in the sex trade, but at any moment in time, if they feel like a pimp is forcing them, threatening them, hurting them, they are now a victim of human trafficking. And it's also important to keep in mind that both federal law and New York law understands that no one under the age of 18 can consent to sell their body. So there is therefore no such thing as a child prostitute. Now, we don't use the word prostitute at all across the Covenant House Federation, but legally with children, there is literally no such thing. Instead, there are far too many commercially sexually exploited children. Just real brief, want to touch on labor trafficking. Also, that's when someone is making money off of you, again, through force, fraud, or coercion, and there's not that age differential. We do see that at Covenant House, although it's less. Often at Covenant House, it's in the form of forced criminal activity. We've seen kids forced to curry drugs as young as 11 or 12, or forced into credit card scams. But it can happen in any industry, whether legal or not legal. And I'm going to bring Melanie in soon, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about some research we did when I first got to Covenant House. When I first got to Covenant House, I knew that pimps and traffickers went after our young people, but we really had no idea of how many, because young people do not show up at Covenant House and say, "Help me, I've been trafficked." They say, "I'm hungry." I need food. I need a bed. So we brought in Fordham University to help us figure out what the right questions to ask. And when we did that, we said, let's also do a prevalence study. And in that study, we found that about 15% of our young people fit that New York State definition of trafficking. And then another 10% were over the age of 18, and we couldn't quite find that same degree of a third-party force, fraud, or coercion, but still felt at some point they felt so desperate that they had to trade sex for something of value. And it is the 21st century in New York City. No young person should ever have to feel like they have to trade sex for a place to stay. But if you put those two numbers together, we're talking about 25% of Covenant House youth. Just in New York City, we see about 2,000 a year. So we're talking about several hundred youth in New York City. And then we replicated that study throughout the Covenant House Federation. And I was really interested to see if, Covenant House in Anchorage, Alaska looks different than Atlantic, New Jersey, or Detroit, Michigan. And sadly, it was the same, because wherever there are vulnerable people, there are people who are going to prey on them. And the numbers throughout that study all hovered around 20% of our young people. Okay, so now I'm going to bring in Mel and Anne, and still talking just a little bit of the background about human trafficking before we get into this legislation and why it's so important. So, Melanie, would you be able to talk to us about some of the pathways to entry for prostitution?
Yeah, thank you, Jane, for that introduction and for your words so far. And yeah, there are so many different pathways of entry. In fact, there's a very long and extensive list. But among that, some of the most prevalent, being a woman or a girl, or identifying as a woman or a girl, being Black or brown, but there is a disproportionate number of Black individuals who are affected in the sex trade. If you are part of the LGBTQIA plus community, that also is an extreme pathway of entry. We know over 40+% of individuals in the sex trade that are impacted are folks who identify in this community, and overwhelmingly in the trans community. You see a lot of that in trafficking. Somebody who's undocumented, as you mentioned, Jane, somebody in the foster care system, absolutely. If you come from poverty, an impoverished community, or marginalization, and anybody with a prior sexual abuse history. Now, there's so many other pathways of entry, and a lot of these often intersect with each other, but these are just some of the biggest ones that we happen to see. And oftentimes we do see that a person impacted in the sex trade that identifies with one of these pathways of entry is usually part of another one as well. In my case, I am a Black person who is queer in the community, who came from poverty, came from a DV household, and then ended up in the foster care system. So as you can see, the intersectionalities there are extremely relevant to what you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the one thing I want to add is young people experiencing homelessness. And you guys, you both know, you talk to me all the time, that one of my biggest pet peeves is how television and the media portrays it, that we can all be trafficked and just like picked off the street in a white van. I mean, yes, technically we can all be victims of human trafficking, but pimps are not stupid, right? They go after the most vulnerable among us. And who is more vulnerable than a young person experiencing homelessness, who doesn't have a father, who's going to like go to the ends of the earth to find them? And also a young person experiencing homelessness, or any of the risk factors you mentioned, makes a young person more susceptible to a trauma bond. And Anne, can you tell us a little bit more about what a trauma bond is?
Absolutely. And thank you to Jane. Thank you to Covenant House for hosting this really important panel. I'm super grateful to be here. So many survivors of the sex trade become traumatically bonded to their perpetrators as a result of the abuse that, Mel and I are going to go into more depth about later on, but trauma bonding is really a result of ongoing cycles of abuse in which the abuser uses the intermittent reinforcement of reward and punishment to create a powerful emotional bond between themselves and the person that they're abusing. So many survivors find it difficult to leave the abuser, to testify against the abuser, because they both love and fear him. Many resist leaving because they're terrified to do so. They've come to believe what the exploiter is telling them, which is that they deserve to be exploited, that it's the only thing that they're good at, that they're defined by their experiences of exploitation. For many, the violence and exploitation becomes normalized, and they can't imagine a life outside of the sex trade. I want to note that so trauma bonds are specifically formed when there are three conditions met. That's when a power imbalance exists between the abuser and the person they're abusing. The abuser creates or maintains that power imbalance through the use of control tactics, and the abuser subjects the person they're abusing to the intermittent reward and punishment throughout the relationship. So a survivor is forced into an abusive cycle where she's trying to form a relationship with and appease the abuser, trying to get back to that part of their relationship where everything seemed to be going well. And the abuser is simultaneously, rewarding her occasionally, buying her maybe gifts, maybe telling her that he loves her, taking her on trips. And then all of a sudden he'll revert to punishment out of the blue unexpectedly. He'll say, I don't like, the dress you're wearing. I don't like the way you looked at that other guy. You didn't take enough buyers. And then he'll use extreme violence and abuse against her. What happens is that the survivor begins to identify with the abuser and adopt his perspective and worldview. And over time, the abuser doesn't even need to use force or violence anymore to compel her cooperation, because she enters a state where she starts to see him as all powerful, and also often starts to believe that she is fortunate to even have him in her life.
Absolutely. It's why at Covenant House, I see all the time young people will come into my office and say, Miss Jane, this is my choice. This is what I want to do. And it's not my job to tell them any differently. It's to listen. But often, like so many times, whether it's 6 months later, a year later, they'll say, you know what? I didn't have a choice, right? I thought I loved him and I thought he loved me. And when you think about Covenant House youth, I think they're so vulnerable to that trauma bond, just like all of the risk factors Melanie said. But I've definitely heard one youth tell me that her pimp was the first person to give her a birthday cake. And I did hear an adult survivor tell me that her pimp was the first person to give her a hug. So that is so easy to make that trauma bond. And that's why even the next day, if they beat the crap out of them, right, they still feel they love them. So in a lot of ways, I feel like it's much more closer to domestic violence and is intimate partner violence more than what television and movies show. And it's also why, just like domestic violence, it often takes 4 or 5 times for a survivor to leave the perpetrator and the pimp, right? I think TV and movie also make it look like we'll just jump in and rescue someone. That's not how it works, right? The young person has to get out of this situation with our help and with our help and support, but often it takes many time. Anne, or both of you, can you talk a little bit more about like the harms that sex buyers do or that pimps do?
Absolutely. And actually, Jane, if you don't mind, because I think this leads into a conversation about the harms, I'll just note really quickly the medical and psychological repercussions of being exploited in the sex trade, of being traumatically bonded to an exploiter. So folks that we work with, they often present with numerous medical issues. I, run the Empower Center. We provide medical, legal, social services to survivors. Our patients come in and we see regularly malnourishment, broken bones, burns, stab wounds, head injuries, anogenital injuries, internal injuries, chronic pain, STIs, and reproductive issues. So the trauma that our patients experience in the sex trade is incomprehensible. Survivors struggle with feelings of guilt, shame, depression. They have severe memory loss, blocked traumatic memories, dissociation. They are often documented to have high rates of psychiatric disorders, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, eating disorders, suicidal ideation, self-injury, post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, this is just to name a few. And these are so prevalent because of the trauma and violence that we were talking about and that we're going to talk about further. So all of the patients that we see, regardless of whether or not they meet the federal or state definitions of human trafficking, if they've been repeatedly bought for sex by strangers, they present with a similar cross-section of medical and psychological harms.
Sorry, keep going.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's a really important point for later. So I just wanted to emphasize that because we see that at Covenant House too. whether the young person identifies as a sex trafficking survivor or someone who's consensually worked in the sex trade, we often see the same mental health and physical health damages.
Absolutely.
But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's great. I'm really glad you underscored that, Jane. So now I'm going to dive in a little bit and talk about why are we seeing such high rates of psychiatric disorders, high rates of medical issues. And it's largely a consequence of the abuse perpetrated by pimps and traffickers, but also by sex buyers. So this is a component of the social issue that's often missing in the media and in research, and it's the integral role played by sex buyers in sustaining the sex trade. And also, we want folks to understand that the buyers of commercial sex victimize people who are in the sex trade are nearly exclusively men. So this is a very gendered form of gender-based violence. So commercial sexual exploitation is a consequence of boys, young men being socialized into a culture of toxic masculinity. So this is a culture where sex is no longer based on mutuality and reciprocity, but it's based on unequal power and control, where one person can meet their pleasure at the expense of another person's physical and psychological health. So we see that when a person, again, this is men we're talking about, use their socioeconomic power to buy sexual access to another person's body, usually a person who has less social power than they do, it creates this very dramatic sense of power over the person that they bought. Buyers often believe it's their right to do whatever they want to the person they purchased. So many buyers will seek a sense of power by demanding particularly violent, degrading sex acts. They demand access to a variety of women and girls, members of the LGBTQ community. They want a variety in age, racialized identity, body type. So you can see how this practice mimics the American economic model of capitalism, but what we're talking about are humans who are being treated as products. And what we're seeing is that buyers are perpetrating very high rates of abuse and violence. And I'll let Mel take over from here.
Thanks, Anne. Before I piggyback on that with sex buyers, I just wanted to go back a little and highlight something that you were mentioning, Jane, about some of the clients that you have at Covenant House that say things like, my pimp is the first person to give me a hug or a birthday cake. Like, I think that really, I want to lift that up because I think that really emphasizes the severity and really legitimizes this link that I think a lot of people are confused about when it comes to consent and trafficking and seeing where those two things kind of meet. And, oftentimes, like you were mentioning, when we talk about trafficking in the movies, what we see is, young people, young adults or children being kidnapped, thrown into the back of a white van, something like that, right? And it's usually always, most people, when we watch these movies, we all agree that that's terrible, right? And I think that what that does, although it is true, there are other ways of ending up in a system of prostitution. And I think that it's created such a misconception in our society about what trafficking actually looks like in all different places as opposed to just one form. And I think that that's where this fuzziness around consent comes. And I'll be talking a little bit about consent a little bit later. But, just to think about the coercion piece of what trafficking actually means and thinking about that, right? Yes, I could have been picked up, thrown in the back of a white van and driven off somewhere and had an Amber Alert out or something like that. But then I also could have had a boyfriend who actually dated me properly, right, for 3 years and met the family and participated in holidays and then automatically switch and say, if you want to prove your love to me, you have to do this, right? Or, hey, we're in a relationship and we're struggling, but if you want to contribute to the betterment of our life, right? If we want to get a house, if we need to get a bed, if we want to eat, you got to start pulling your weight, right? So I just wanted to highlight that because I think that when we talk about trafficking as a society, we don't highlight those things so much. We only talk about someone having a gun to their head. And that's how this separation between trafficking victims and people who consent, that's where that differentiation comes, because people think trafficking is just this one way. But absolutely. To jump to your question on sex buyers and the harms, I honestly tell people all the time, and for most people it comes as a shock. Everything that Anne said is true. And often, I personally, in my experience, sex buyers were more harmful than my traffickers. Now, that's not to say that the pimps that I've had and the people who have kidnapped me and the people who were trafficking me were not violent people. They were, right? I ended up with a lot of different pimps, a lot of different traffickers, people who would pistol whip me, people who would put knives in my throat. I have burns on my cheeks that are still here years later, right? And it's super imperative to not minimize the harms that they inflict onto us. But I think, in my personal opinion, where I want people to focus on when it comes to sex buyers is that when it comes to traffickers and when it comes to pimps, the violence that they inflict onto us, to me, is very cyclical, right? They use the same, I don't know how many it is, and in the cycle of abuse or cycle of violence, how many different forms of coercion there is. I think there's 6. I might be wrong. But usually with pimps, you know what you're getting. You're either going to get beaten, you're either going to get threatened, you're either going to have maybe someone in your family or somebody close to you be threatened. And it's usually the same thing. So after a while, many of us that have lived in the sex trade know that our pimps are going to use one of those types of tactics. But with sex buyers, because of what Anne was mentioning about this power and control and taking advantage of somebody that has less social and economic status than them, sex buyers are really a wild card, right? Oftentimes, you never know. Sex buyers can become very violent if you don't give them what they want, right? A lot of times, sex buyers will say that they're coming in for one thing, but then they want to change it up in the middle and don't have the funds to support that. And if you deny that, that's a problem for them. If a sex buyer comes in and says, yeah, I'm totally cool with using condoms or something like that, but then you tell them this is what I want and they change their mind behind closed doors, they can oftentimes get violent, curse you out, all types of things behind closed doors. And I think what makes sex buyers even more violent in some cases than the traffickers is that idea and that feeling that they have a right to buy what they want to buy. They have a right to control you, that male entitlement, that privileged entitlement of saying, well, I have what you don't and what you need. And because of that, you have to do what I say. And I think that that's what makes them even more dangerous because they're a wild card in the life.
Absolutely. And before we get to the legislation, which was so important, I just want to talk a little bit about what Covenant House does. But first, Mel, thank you for sharing some of that. I hear you speak all the time, and I'm awed every single time. You're such an amazing, fierce advocate. But about Covenant House, so I work at Covenant House, New York, and we serve young people between the ages of 16 to 24. And what I think is really important to mention is that a lot of times people think, of sex trafficking of children, and it is very heartbreakingly sad, the age that people enter the sex trade. I think, Melanie, you were about 12. But we've noticed at Covenant House that our 18 and 19-year-olds are actually at huge risk. And that's for 2 reasons. Number one, the law cracks down on sex with children, right? So a lot of times pimps and traffickers like to go after people who are 18, but they can pass off as younger. And also, it's the first age that a lot of young people become homeless, because that's the age where you can legally sign yourself out of foster care, or your mom or grandma can legally kick you out of the house. So what do we do for young people at Covenant House? First thing is, in the prevention arena, many survivors, when I've talked to them about their stories and asked them like what could have prevented this, I usually get one of 3 answers: an adult who cares, job training and education, and a place to stay. So that is what we provide at all of our Covenant House shelters. I think we've got 33 of them. I feel like it is our job to get to our young people and be that adult who cares before the pimp and trafficker does. And they make it difficult for us because they lie to our young people in Times Square. They'll say, don't go to the Cub, they're full, when that's not even true. But it's our job to be that adult who cares. But real quickly, across the Federation, so at New York, we have a dedicated anti-trafficking team who've got smaller caseloads. Covenant House California and Toronto have dedicated safe houses, and there might be a few other sites who have that as well. Covenant House New Jersey runs, I think, their entire human trafficking response across the entire state. And then our CASAs in Latin America are doing incredible work. They have programs especially for trafficked children, and they do all sorts of wonderful things like equine therapy. They do the rapid eye movement therapy. So we're really looking at combating trafficking at all levels. And I do a new orientation for staff every month for new staff. And I always tell them, it doesn't matter what department you're in, you are on the front line of human trafficking. prevention, right? Because you're providing young people with that job training and education so that they don't have to work at the strip club, which leads to trafficking and prostitution. And you are providing that place to stay and that adult who cares. So now I think it's a good point to talk about this legislation. It's a little bit controversial. I don't see why. But Anne, can you, or Anne or Mel, can one of you like talk about the models of prostitution and the tenets of this legislation?
Absolutely. So I'll give folks, as quickly as possible. This is a very nuanced, dense topic, so we're going to do it as quickly as we can. And we recognize that there is information that we won't be able to share right now. Please, there are going to be some resources dropped in the chat. Please, check out those resources if you're interested to know more. We're really concerned. There are three primary models, global models that are used to address the issue of prostitution. But right now in the United States and in New York State specifically, we are looking at, we have a full criminalization model where all actors in the commercial sex trade are criminalized. But we are looking at two competing bills that have been introduced to the New York State legislature. Our bill that was introduced by a coalition called New Yorkers for the Equality Model, of which we are all members. Our bill specifically views the commercial sex trade as an inherently harmful trade that is a form of severe gender-based violence. So our bill, what it really tries to do is convey that we need to stop arresting and incarcerating people who are being bought and sold in the sex trade. We do not believe that they should be criminalized for their own exploitation. So we want that part of the penal law to be amended so that they're no longer criminalized. And then we also recognize that it's very important. Our bill, which is called the Equality Model, seeks to also enhance services, comprehensive services for survivors of the sex trade. We want to make sure that they are able to access everything that they need and deserve, so that they are not, coerced or compelled to sell sex in order to access, food, housing, clothing, medical care, etc. The opposing bill, which is called a full decriminalization bill, which is not a bill that we support, actually treats prostitution as a form of labor. It does not recognize all of the harms that Mel, Jane, and I discussed today. It essentially says that the sex trade, if it were fully decriminalized and integrated into our economy as just another form of a labor, that magically all of the harms would disappear. And that bill, what it seeks to do is decriminalize promoting, which is the legal language for pimping. So to decriminalize pimping, to decriminalize sex buying, to clear criminal convictions for folks who are convicted of pimping or sex buying, as well as decriminalizing the buying and selling of sex. So that bill is definitely a bill that we do not support, because our bill, what we would like to see happen is we want the folks who are being bought and sold in the sex trade to be decriminalized, but we want to maintain prohibitions against sex buying and pimping and sex trafficking. So our bill actually seeks to strengthen laws that prohibit sex trafficking. Our bill includes a provision that we essentially are calling it like the Jeffrey Epstein provision. So our bill would make it a form of sex trafficking if a sex buyer, as Jeffrey Epstein was, traffics people to himself. So we are really working to ensure that the various ways that sex trafficking takes place are recognized in law, and that men who exploit the vulnerabilities of others in the commercial sex trade are held accountable for that. So we'll probably, Mel and Jane will probably jump in as well to try to clarify a bit more, because it's a very complicated topic, and we know that sometimes folks walk away a little bit confused about the differences between the two bills.
Thank you so much for that, Anne. I want to talk a little bit about how it affects Covenant House youth. A few things, though. We're talking about a New York bill, but this is a debate that's going on across the country and across the world about people trying to fully decriminalize it, and people like us who realize how dangerous that is and prefer to or want to partially decriminalize it. And I also do want to add, too, that young men can also be victims of trafficking, and we see that at Covenant House as well. But we see that the numbers of young women or female identified are much higher. Now, I have to be honest, before I did this work, although I've been doing this work for about 15 years now, but before I did this work, I might have said, you know what, consenting adults should be able to do whatever they want. And I might have believed, like, okay, yeah, why not? I mean, they're consenting adults. Why not fully decriminalize prostitution? And doing this work has really changed my mind, because when you decriminalize something, it expands, right? I've always seen it like there's three groups of, and it's mostly male identified, of men when it comes to sex buying, right? One group that is just never going to buy sex, right? They don't believe in it. They love their spouses. There are advocates, right? And then there's a group that's always going to buy sex. It doesn't matter if it's illegal or not. But there is a third group that won't buy it. They don't want to be arrested. They don't want their name in the paper. But if it was legal, maybe they would try it. So research shows, and not just research, but studies from across the world where they've actually tried it. When you decriminalize something, it expands, right? So it brings much more money into it makes it a trade. It makes it a sex trade. But there are some, but there's still only a limited number of people willing to consensually sell sex. So do you think the pimps and traffickers are going to leave all of that extra money on the table? No, right? They're going to recruit and lure more people in to meet that demand. And guess who they're going to recruit? They're going to recruit Covenant House youth. They already try it, right? One already put an ad in Craigslist about 7 years ago saying, hey, you live at the Cove? I can help you make more money, right? So brazen. Fortunately, we were able to show that ad to our law enforcement partners, and they did an investigation and found a multi-state trafficking ring. But just think, if prostitution was fully decriminalized, that ad would have been perfectly legal, right? Because most of our young people are over the age of 18, and there would have been no reason to investigate, and they would have never found the trafficking. So it would be completely legal to open up a recruitment center right across from all of Covenant House shelters. And let's be clear, like, they're not going to be doing the recruiting outside of NYU or Fordham or Columbia. They're going to do it outside of Covenant Houses. They're already trying, but at least now we can have law enforcement to stop them. Either one of you want to kind of hit the argument, and you talked about this a little bit, about how it doesn't make things, people who argue for full decrim say that it actually will make things safer. Can either one of you touch on why it would not make things safer?
Mel, do you want to tackle first, and then I can tag team?
The reality is that prostitution isn't safe. Like, innately, it's not safe, and you can't make it safe because, again, this is not a job like any other. This is not work like any other. This is an insidious trade that specifically thrives off of exploiting folks' vulnerabilities, right? So when you have a system that's like the system of prostitution that is created and thrives off of sex buyers exploiting somebody for what they don't have, there's nothing safe in that. So we try, a lot of people want to be progressive and want to find ways to make it safer so that people can, choose to do something like this. But the reality is that at the bottom line, no matter how you want to decriminalize it, no matter how much you want to change the language surrounding the issue, it's still at the core comes down to what sex buyers feel is their right, because of the money that they have or because of the resources that they have. So all in all, no matter how you dress it up, it's still the exploitation of someone's lack of resources, someone's marginalization, someone's vulnerability. Even for the folks 18, 19, 20 that folks will say, oh, well, they chose to do this. They chose to work in a strip club. They chose to put an ad. On the surface, that might be true. I might have decided, let me go on Craigslist right now and post an ad of myself. But because that came from my lack of resources, because that came from me not having enough food, and I decided, well, it's either I'm going to continue to go hungry until I die, or I'm going to put an ad out here and make the choice to sell sex. Under that surface level choice, you're still coming down to someone is going to pay for sexual access to me. So there's nothing safe about that. And it gets even more harmful when you try to deny somebody of what they feel is their right to you. So, people try to dress it up and say, oh, well, if we decriminalize it, then people can safely report to police. People can safely, do things, add condoms, and all types of different things that they think will make the sex buyer's rights, their feeling of their right to go away. And the reality is you cannot put a condom on somebody's feeling of entitlement. It just doesn't work like that.
So well said, Mel. Thank you. And I'll add that internationally, there have been a number of countries that have experimented with this, full decriminalization model, or the idea that the sex trade can be made safe if it's just fully decriminalized or legalized. A number of countries have tried it, and what those countries have seen is a very terrifying expansion of sex trafficking in those countries. And it's trafficking of women and children from the global south. They have found that in all of those countries, that the majority of people in the legal brothels are actually there under some form of force, fraud, or coercion. In other words, they're trafficked. They're victims of sex trafficking. They find that the violence and harm certainly doesn't reduce. And in fact, when the sex trade expands and sex trafficking expands, then actually what you're seeing is an expansion in the violence and harm that's being perpetrated. They find that traffickers primarily target the most vulnerable. And why do they do that? Because these are the folks who have the least power and control, and they can make the most profit off of them, because they can coerce them into performing more sexual acts, and they can sell them for more money to buyers who are demanding particularly violent and degrading sex acts. And we find that buyers, are specifically seeking more vulnerable people, because they want to be able to control them when that door closes. They want to be able to demand the very violent sex acts. And so they specifically go after, poor, indigenous, Black and brown children, folks who they know are going to have far less power and control to report them. So the sex trade, the only place where we've seen the sex trade actually reduced in size, and sex trafficking nearly eliminated, is in Sweden, which is the country that pioneered the model that we endorse, the equality model, where they said this needs to be treated like a severe form of gender-based violence, such as domestic violence is, and we need to try to discourage people from buying sex and men from engaging in pimping and trafficking, and we need to provide exit services and support to people who are in the sex trade.
Absolutely. And I also want to add, with the equality model, that does decriminalize the person selling sex, right? Because they're either a trafficking survivor or a vulnerable, marginalized person, and who is not hurting anyone, right? So if the safety issue is oftentimes the person selling sex is afraid to go to the police, there would be no way, no one would ever be arrested or prosecuted for selling sex, right? Because they need social services, not handcuffs. So I think that's really important. Also want to underscore that if there were no sex buyers, there would be no sex trafficking, right? Let me say that again. If there were no sex buyers, there would be no sex trafficking. So why would we want to do anything that increases the number of sex buyers, which is exactly what full decriminalization does. Also want to add again that our young people are 18. So it would be at Covenant House, 16 to 24 at New York, but we have a lot of 18, 19, 20 up through 24. It would be perfectly legal to lure them in, right, to trafficking. And there's not, I've been working with these young people for 11 years. There's not something magical that happens on that 18th birthday. And even if they're not trafficked, but they're lured in, once you get into the life of the prostitution, it's really hard to get out of it. So, Anne, Mel, we have about 5 minutes before the Q&A. Either just anything on why this equality model is so important, or why we don't like the phrase sex workers work. So whoever answers first on either of those questions.
I can have a whole session on why I don't use the term sex workers work, but being mindful of time, I guess I'll say one to each. I don't use the term sex workers work, one, because I say sex work is neither. Sex is not work and work is not sex. I do not legitimize sex as a form of work for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, but also most people view prostitution, or what some call sex work, as an individual choice. And as I explained earlier, you cannot make a choice if you do not have choices. So if you come from a lack of resources and then you make a surface choice to do something because of the desperation of your lack of resources, that is not work, nor can it be an actual choice, which is why prostitution is a system. But on the equality model, The reason for me, one of my favorite things about the equality model and why I support it is because it's the only legislation out of all the models that Anne went over that actually has a part that focuses on aftercare services. When we talk about the debate globally on this issue and on the different legal approaches to this issue, we have criminalization, which just arrests everybody. You have legalization, which we see in other countries like Germany, where everything is legal and it's a free-for-all with some state tax regulations and other things. But under this equality model, this partial decriminalization model, we're on one hand holding buyers and traffickers accountable, but we're also saying, okay, now that we've handled them, for lack of a better term, what do we do with the person that we just decriminalize out of this system? Because you can take me off of the street, but if you don't provide me with any aftercare services, all I'm going to do is relapse and go back to the street. So under the equality model, there's a focus on healthcare, there's a focus on therapy, there's a focus on rehab. I call them rehab services, like getting back into the job force and financial sustainability. These are the things that we as survivors need to sustain our lives and learn how to engage with gainful employment as opposed to going back to the sex trade. So for me, the equality model is the first step in that direction, to focus on what we need to rehabilitate our lives so that we do not see the system of prostitution as a viable option again.
So well said. Anne, anything to add to that?
I would absolutely agree. And I really appreciate the equality model because it really focuses on changing cultural norms that tell us that it's okay to use our socioeconomic power to buy sexual access to someone with less power. It's really a commitment to, I think it's a commitment to ensuring that there are systems in place so that people are not made vulnerable to the exploitation of the sex trade and to, predators who comprise the sex trade. And it really says that, that we should not be teaching our young children that consent can be purchased. Because I think when we say that consent is something that is purchasable, we're all of a sudden making consent a meaningless concept. It's saying that, okay, there's a specific cast of individuals that we're going to set aside. And these are the most impoverished, these are members of the LGBTQ community. These are, women, children of color, that we're going to set them aside and say that they can be bought for sex and that their, vulnerabilities can be exploited and that their consent is just can be overcome. They don't want to be having sex with these strangers, but we can overcome that revulsion with some money. And then it says, oh, everybody else, you don't have to do this. Like if you got enough money and you have a nice bed to sleep in, a home to come home to, you got parents who are taking care of you, you don't have to worry about that. No one's going to try to force you to consent to sex you don't want to have. And the last thing I want to remind folks, I always try to base this in reality for folks. We're talking about, just put yourself in these shoes. We're talking about folks who are being bought 5 times, 10 times, 15, 20 times a day by strangers for sex. These are individuals they don't know, they're going into a room with, they're having to be naked with, and the potential for violence and abuse, and also the need to dissociate in order to get through these painful sex acts result in a lot of physical, psychological repercussions. So we work really hard to say we need to reduce the size of the sex trade. We need to close the on-ramps into the sex trade and provide exit ramps for folks. And that's what the equality model really strives to do.
Absolutely. And we're turning to Q&A now, but I just think, we want less Covenant House youth lured into the sex trade. And if it was work like any other work, why do so many people who've, enter it have been previously sexually abused, right? What other job is that a prerequisite, right? Previously sexually abused. And so many, regardless of whether they feel it's consensual or been trafficked, end up needing to dissociate to get through the day, whether through substances and mental health problems. So what other job is that the consequence, and previous abuse the prerequisite? And I think now it is time for Q&A.
Hello, Jane. Hi, Melanie. And this has just been an incredibly powerful and moving and extremely informative discussion. We have questions that have come in from the audience. And so let's begin with the first question that's come in. How can people support the equity model effort?
I'll start, but maybe Melanie, and you can jump in. First of all, we need support really badly because we are getting crushed on social media. I think, this is the rational opinion. It makes the most sense, but in a world that is based on sound bites and tweets, sex work is work gets as a hashtag that gets a lot. So we feel like the minority, we feel like we're getting crushed. So we need that support on social media. We do, I think we're going to put it up later. We have a QR code for a petition that you can sign. We also want other organizations to get involved because right now it's not the popular opinion. And I think that's people are making decisions without understanding the full reality. So we need as many voices as possible. So sign that petition, share our social media, both Covenant Houses, New Yorkers for the Equality Model, come to some meetings for the New York State Anti-Trafficking Coalition and others around the country. Anything to add to that, Anne or Mel?
That was perfect.
Perfect. Here's a question that's come in from Jennifer Scott Dewar. Jennifer, thank you for this question. Please discuss a city with partial decriminalization and its challenges and any positives with the change.
I think that's for you, Anne, right? Because you're our guru on this issue.
So partial decriminalization is the language that we use. It also we refer to our model as the equality model, so you can use those interchangeably. So in the countries that have implemented partial decriminalization or the equality model, what they've seen is a dramatic reduction in the size of the sex trade. And they've seen an incredible reduction in the amount of sex trafficking that happens in those cities. I lived in Sweden for a year researching the model, and I had the opportunity to visit 3 service centers that they pioneered. And these were centers where they co-located medical, legal, social services, and economic empowerment services for survivors of the sex trade. So these were, free services that they could access. We actually, with the Empower Center, we brought that to New York City. So we now have one of those centers here as well. So what you see in countries that pioneer this model is a commitment to increasing free services for survivors, a commitment to changing cultural norms so that people recognize that sex is about mutuality and reciprocity and not something that should be purchased. And you also see discouraging of sex trafficking and pimping and sex buying.
And that's, I think, Sweden, Israel, right? There's been several places have tried it.
France actually is the strongest legislation that's been introduced so far. They amended 8 of their legislative codes to integrate this the equality model into their the way that they're addressing this issue. There are a number of countries, yes, that have implemented the model.
And in all of them, sex trafficking was reduced. The U.S. does not have a city yet, but we're fighting in New York. We're fighting all across the country, right? I think we've got New Orleans, California, a lot of places where there are Covenant House sites, a lot of places that are not. But, we're fighting, but we're up against the full decriminalization. There's a lot of people supporting that. And then there's a lot of people supporting partial decriminalization, the equality model. And we need to gain momentum.
We need to keep momentum. Absolutely. This question comes in from Kelly Brown. I know trafficking is a huge problem in bigger cities, and we just talked about some of the bigger cities just now, but wondering if I could ask one of you to speak on how much may be happening in smaller towns and rural communities.
Absolutely. First of all, Covenant House did a 13 site study, and it didn't matter where there was, that the number hovered around 20% of young people experiencing homelessness. I think in rural areas, I work very closely with someone named Jamie Popovich, who is the executive director of the Coalition for Homeless Youth. And she deals with a lot of runaway and homeless youth shelters upstate. It is just as much there. I mean, anywhere where there are people who are vulnerable, there will be people who prey off of them. And in the rural areas, there's fewer places to get help, right? There's fewer resources. So that's often a huge problem. So they have this same amount of trafficking, but they have less resources.
Thank you. Here's a question from Shamale Gorman. Are there safe houses in all 50 states?
That is a good question. I don't know, and I would guess not. I do not know 100%. What I do know is that when I'm trying to find a bed for a young person who's not in New York City and not in a Covenant House site, it can be difficult. Sometimes, I definitely have worked with places in Pennsylvania and Florida, but even when there is a shelter, there's often not beds, right? And that's true, obviously, in New York as well. I've spent a lot of time trying to find beds for people all across the country, and it's not easy. I don't know, Mel or Ann, if you have, I don't have data on it. I just know that it's very difficult to find beds.
That's helpful. Thanks, Jane. Mel, I need to share this with you. This came in on the chat. Thank you so much for doing this. My heart is with you, sister. You are telling the truth here. And Mel, can you share with us, why are youth of color, youth in foster care, and LGBTQ plus youth at higher risk?
To be honest, and I didn't have time in this chat today to really get into the nitty gritty of it, but a lot of it goes back to some historical systems like slavery, which is why racism, we see huge connections to that. And we can talk on another time about colonialism and how that has directly translated to what we see now. But it's also because the majority of these communities, Black, women, girls, LGBTQ plus identifying folks, foster youth, undocumented, and Indigenous folks, we make up the majority of people in poverty and marginalized circumstances. So it's not to say trafficking affects anybody. I will tell, it does not see color, race, gender, whatever. But the reality is that most folks of privilege are usually white individuals who come from some type of financial stability or parental household stability, usually two-parent homes, maybe their parents are married, they can afford to pay their own tuition. And unfortunately, for communities that are full of people that look like me, we don't come from the same amount of resources. So we are the biggest targets on a system that preys on people with no other options. And that just happens to be people of color, LGBTQ plus identifying, etc.
Thank you, Melanie. Here's a question that's coming from Linda Frazier. What guidelines are set up to protect those who've been trafficked and at new jobs to make sure they're safe and not exploited again?
What we talked about before about people are often trafficked many, many times, right? Because of the trauma bond. And it's all about resources, making sure the survivors know that there are resources out there. But I remember once, one of our first clients, the Safe House in New York, she was doing so well. And then one day she went to a party and her former pimp was there. And not only did she go back, but she tried to take the other young women in the house with her. And that broke my heart because we had to discharge her. And I remember telling to Sistine Nancy, who's the executive director of Covenant House, I'm like, this program is a failure. Let's close it down. I was miserable. And she was like, no. You've got to redefine success for whatever the many months she was in a place with adults who cared and no one was hurting her and she was making progress and she knows that we're here. So sure enough, about 6 months later, she came back, spent another year with us. And now I think she's in nursing school and doing great. So I think the question was about preventing re-trafficking. And the fact is, it happens all of the time, but it's about making sure that there are enough resources so that people know that there's always a safe place that they can go back to. And also to work with law enforcement to make sure there are the laws that will put traffickers behind bars. The full decriminalization movement might make that harder because law enforcement finds trafficking through its investigation of prostitution. So if prostitution is decriminalized, there will be, and a lot of my friends in law enforcement in the DA's office will say it'll be much harder to prosecute trafficking. So we have to make sure that doesn't happen.
I want to add to that and say it's also about helping, giving folks a chance to develop a more robust sense of themselves, right? Like a lot of folks are exploited when they are children or teens. So they're denied the opportunity to explore their passions, their interests, their life goals. they're really trained by the pimps and the sex buyers to believe that this is all they're worth and this is all they're good at. And so it's really helping folks move along a healing journey where they can start to explore, what is it that I actually want? Like, other people have been using me, making me do these things, but what do I want out of my life? Like, who do I want to be? What are the things that, dreams I want to accomplish, goals I have for myself? And that in and of itself, I think, is a fundamental component of helping folks leave the life permanently.
Thank you. We have so many questions, and I'm going to try to get to as many as we can. Here's one from Jesselyn Berry. How are you supporting clients, peers who themselves take a sex work is work stance in terms of social services and psychological support?
Absolutely. So at Covenant House, we're going to serve everyone. We don't care if you fall in the definition of sex trafficked or not. We don't use the term trafficked. I usually try to mirror the language that the young person uses back. So, I mean, in advocacy work, I don't like the term sex work because of the reasons Melanie said, but I'm going to use whatever language the young person uses because they have a right to identify as anyway. And it's not my job to talk them out of it. It's my job to make sure they have the resources they need and that they feel safe. And that in time, I've noticed that as therapy happens, as they get more confident in job training and education, they often start to realize that their experiences were exploitive, but it's not our job to tell them that, right? I mean, that's just kind of the overall mindset at Covenant House is our young people are figuring things out for themselves. We're just providing them with the resources to do that.
Thank you. Here's a question. What interventions can occur in a trafficked individual between the ages of 18 and 20?
While they're being trafficked, or just while they're being trafficked? I mean, that's what we deal with at Covenant House all the time, right? So it's about, again, it goes back to the same things. Adults who care, job training and education, and a place to stay, right? If someone feels like, that's why living wages are so important in job training and education. If someone feels that they can get the money and support themselves, they are much less likely to stay with the trafficker. So it's all about the same things, making people feel better self-esteem and giving them the tools.
And we offer, like the Empower Center, we offer a number of workshops for folks to participate in. One that we really love is a 10-week curriculum called Ending the Game that was developed by survivors. And it's a coercion resiliency workshop that helps folks overcome the psychological coercion, so helps them overcome the trauma bond. But I think the brilliance of it is that it's bringing together survivors so that they can, recognize I'm not to be blamed. I shouldn't be blamed for what's been done to me. I'm actually a survivor. I deserve respect. I deserve services. Others have experienced this too. And it actually creates a safe space where sisterhood develops between the survivors. And then we also think it's really important, for folks to get a chance to explore, like I said, their passions and interests. So we offer, economic workshops, yoga, kickboxing, cooking classes. I mean, pretty much you name it. As a wellness workshop, we offer it.
And that's us too at Covenant House. And in New York, we've got this beautiful new building to do it in, right? So, and we say, like, every moment they're in our gym and they're in our art room and they're in our music room, they're not on the street where traffickers are lurking.
Absolutely. One question, we're going to squeeze in one last question. You referenced Craigslist. You talked about that earlier. In terms of technology, how do we keep youth from connecting with their traffickers and pimps?
Before I answer that, though, is the QR code gone up at all? Can we put that on the screen just to make sure we have this petition in Albany and we need people to, yes, please sign that petition. Please get people to sign it because, again, legislators are hearing more of sex work as work. And the question, again, was about technology?
Yes. How can we keep our youth from connecting with their traffickers? And
it's really, really difficult. I was just on another panel. If you're a parent, it's all about open communication and monitoring that social media. And if you're dealing with young people experiencing homelessness like we are at Covenant House, it's really about talking to them, right? Like person offering you a free meal and just telling you you're beautiful. And it's not that you're not beautiful, but if a stranger is telling you that, that could be a dangerous situation. And yes, our young people are, we could do a whole hour on social media. That's how a large number of the young people I work with get lured into trafficking situations.
Thank you so much. Thank you for helping me understand, and thank you for helping our audience understand as well. Eden Rose has a question. Actually, it's more of a statement. I will adjust, my narrative based upon the information that was shared today. Melanie, Jane, Anne, thank you so much. I want to thank the audience for being with us today. This has been powerful, moving, inspiring, and it gives us a call to action and resources so that we can each make a difference and advocate to move the needle on this. So thank you all. And in terms of action items for our audience, to learn more about how to get involved or ask additional questions, just simply email rsvp@covenanthouse.org, rsvp@covenanthouse.org. Jane, I'm going to turn it back to you to just kind of reinforce the importance of the QR code. And then
yes,
we'll close out.
And thank you so much for hosting and moderating. Yes, please, we put on the screen, you put your camera on it and it gets you to a link. We need as many signatures on that as possible. Because again, people see just sex work is work on Twitter and they sign on to something without realizing what they're signed on to. So we need to make sure that our numbers not only match theirs, but double theirs. So please sign on and spread the word. And we're looking for both individuals and organizational sign-ons.
Jane, and anyone can sign on, is that right? Not just New Yorkers?
Mm-hmm. Yep, anyone can sign on. They do ask for a zip code, but anyone can sign on because there are movements going on across the country. So thank you all so much for just spending this time with us and learning about the issue.
Thank you.